1977, by Jacques Lacan. Jacques-Marie-Émile Lacan, the 13th of April 1901 to the 9th of September 1981, was a French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. Described as the most controversial psychoanalyst since Freud, Lacan gave yearly seminars in Paris from 1953 to 1981, and published papers that were later collected in the book Ecrits. His work made a significant impact on continental philosophy and cultural theory in areas such as post-structuralism, critical theory, feminist theory and film theory, as well as on the practice of psychoanalysis itself. Lacan took up and discussed the whole range of Freudian concepts, emphasizing the philosophical dimension of Freud's thought and applying concepts derived from structuralism in linguistics and anthropology to its development in his own work, which he would further augment by employing formulae from predicate logic and topology. Taking this new direction, and introducing controversial innovations in clinical practice, led to expulsion for Lacan and his followers from the International Psychoanalytic Association. In consequence, Lacan went on to establish new psychoanalytic institutions to promote and develop his work, which he declared to be a return to Freud, in opposition to prevalent trends in psychology and institutional psychoanalysis collusive of adaptation to social norms. Psychoanalytic theory is the theory of personality organization and the dynamics of personality development relating to the practice of psychoanalysis, a clinical method for treating psychopathology. First laid out by Sigmund Freud in the late 19th century, psychoanalytic theory has undergone many refinements since his work. The psychoanalytic theory came to full prominence in the last third of the 20th century as part of the flow of critical discourse regarding psychological treatments after the 1960s, long after Freud's death in 1939. Freud had ceased his analysis of the brain and his physiological studies and shifted his focus to the study of the psyche, and on treatment using free association and the phenomena of transference. His study emphasized the recognition of childhood events that could influence the mental functioning of adults. His examination of the genetic and then the developmental aspects gave the psychoanalytic theory its characteristics. Starting with his publication of The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, his theories began to gain prominence. Psychoanalysis is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a therapeutic method, originated by Sigmund Freud, for treating mental disorders by investigating the interaction of conscious and unconscious elements in the patient's mind and bringing repressed fears and conflicts into the conscious mind, using techniques such as dream interpretation and free association. Also, a system of psychological theory is associated with this method. To the mirror stage, French, stade du miroir, is a concept in the psychoanalytic theory of Jacques Lacan. The mirror stage is based on the belief that infants recognize themselves in a mirror, literal or other symbolic contraption which induces apperception, the turning of oneself into an object that can be viewed by the child from outside themselves, from the age of about 6 months. Mirror stage. Lacan, the young child's identification with his own image, what Lacan terms the ideal I, or ideal ego, a stage that occurs anywhere from 6 to 18 months of age. For Lacan, this act marks the primordial recognition of oneself as I, although at a point before entrance into language and the symbolic order. This stage is misrecognition or mechanisance, seeing an ideal I where there is a fragmented, chaotic body. Subsequently, characterizes the ego in all its structures, Ecrits 6. In particular, this creation of an ideal version of the self gives pre-verbal impetus to the creation of narcissistic fantasies in the fully developed subject. That fantasy image of oneself can be filled in by others who we may want to emulate in our adult lives, role models, etc., anyone that we set up as a mirror for ourselves. The mirror stage establishes what Lacan terms the imaginary order, and, through the imaginary, continues to assert its influence on the subject even after the subject enters the symbolic order. See the Lacan module on psychosexual development. Lacan's reinterpretation of Freud, with the central focus on language, brought about a post-structuralist turn to psychoanalytic theory. In his paper titled Mirror Stage 1949, Lacan expounds the concept of the mirror stage that occurs between 6 to 18 months of a child's development, when the child begins to draw rudimentary distinction between the self and the other, as it encounters its image in the mirror. Before this, the child is from birth in the real stage, driven by needs and lived in unity with the mother. With the mirror stage, the child attains the first realization of its bodily autonomy. Thus begins the lifelong process of identifying the self in terms of the other man, woman, west, east, and so on. The image reflected according to Lacan is the ideal I, the stable and autonomous version which the child does not experience in itself and hence yearns to be the other. This quest, Lacan says, will never be fulfilled and may lead to anxiety, neurosis, and psychosis. The child also realizes that, prior to this stage, its body was in bits and pieces, and realizes the danger of returning to that stage. The mirror stage also marks the beginning of a gradual transition from the imaginary pre-linguistic stage, where the child does not recognize the demarcation between itself and the objects in the world, and the symbolic stage of language acquisition. In the imaginary stage, the self is a unified, coherent whole, not fragmented or mediated by differences. However, on the realization of the immanent presence of the other, the self is divided, and this marks the breakdown of the comforting imaginary condition, and it thrusts the child into the symbolic order, the world of predefined social roles and gender differences, the world of subjects and objects, the world of language. The mirror phase occurs roughly between the ages of 6 and 18 months and corresponds to Freud's stage of primary narcissism. That is the stage of human development when the subject is in love with the image of themselves and their own bodies, and which precedes the love of others. Between the ages of 6 and 18 months the infant begins to recognize his/her image in the mirror. This does not mean a literal mirror but rather any reflective surface, for example the mother's face, and this is usually accompanied by pleasure. The child is fascinated with its image and tries to control and play with it. Although the child initially confuses its image with reality, she soon recognizes that the image has its own properties, finally accepting that the image is their own image, a reflection of themselves. During the mirror stage, then, the child for the first time becomes aware, through seeing its image in the mirror, that his/her body has a total form. The infant can also govern the movements of this image through the movements of its own body and thus experiences pleasure. This sense of completeness and mastery, however, is in contrast to the child's experience of its own body, over which it does not yet have full motor control. While the infant still feels his/her body to be in parts, as fragmented and not yet unified, it is the image that provides him/her with a sense of unification and wholeness. The mirror image, therefore, anticipates the mastery of the infant's own body and stands in contrast to the feelings of fragmentation the infant experiences. What is important at this point is that the infant identifies with this mirror image. The image is him/herself. This identification is crucial, as without it, and without the anticipation of mastery that it establishes, the infant would never get to the stage of perceiving him/herself as a complete or whole being. At the same time, however, the image is alienating in the sense that it becomes confused with the self. The image actually comes to take the place of the self. Therefore, the sense of a unified self is acquired at the price of this self being another, that is, our mirror image. Lacan describes it like this. The mirror stage is a drama whose internal thrust is precipitated from insufficiency to anticipation, and which manufactures for all the subject, caught up in the lure of spatial identification, the succession of fantasies that extends from a fragmented body image to a form of its totality that I shall call orthopedic, and, lastly, to the assumption of the armor of an alienating identity, which will mark with its rigid structure the infant's entire mental development. For Lacan, the ego emerges at this moment of alienation and fascination with one's own image. The ego is both formed by and takes its form from the organizing and constituting properties of the image. The ego is the effect of images. It is, in short, an imaginary function. Lacan is arguing here against ego psychology and its tendency to prioritize the ego over unconscious processes as well as to equate the ego with the self. Lacan insists that the ego is based on an illusory image of wholeness and mastery, and it is the function of the ego to maintain this illusion of coherence and mastery. The function of the ego is, in other words, one of misrecognition, of refusing to accept the truth of fragmentation and alienation. According to Lacan, from the moment the image of unity is posited in opposition to the experience of fragmentation, the subject is established as a rival to itself. A conflict is produced between the infant's fragmented sense of self and the imaginary autonomy out of which the ego is born. The same rivalry established between the subject and him herself is also established in future relations between the subject and others. As Benvenuto and Kennedy put it, the primary conflict between identification with, and primordial rivalry with, the other's image, begins a dialectical process that links the ego to more complex social situations. 1986, 58. To exist, one has to be recognized by another. But this means that our image, which is equal to ourselves, is mediated by the gaze of the other. The other, then, becomes the guarantor of ourselves. We are at for once dependent on the other as the guarantor of our own existence and a bitter rival to that same other. Critics of Lacan's mirror stage argue that he in fact has things completely the wrong way round. In order for the subject to identify with an image in the mirror and then to misrecognize themselves, they must first have a sense of themselves as a self. If the Lacanian subject is an alienated subject, then this presupposes a non-alienated subject in the first instance, otherwise there is nothing that one can meaningfully be said to be alienated from. Hence, the idea of a primary lack or absence is based upon the presupposition of a primary presence or unity. Lack in this sense is secondary and not primary. Anthony Elliot argues that the very terms of Lacan's mirror stage are all wrong. Mirror reflection, lack and absence are not pre-existing phenomena but the work of the subject and the imaginary. Lacan's use of the term alienation is rather different from that of his critics though. Through the mirror stage the infant imagines that it achieves mastery over its own body but in a place outside of itself. Alienation, in Lacan, is precisely this, lack of being, through which the infant's realization, in both senses of the term, forming a distinct concept in the mind and becoming real, lies in another place. In this sense, the subject is not alienated from something or from itself but rather alienation is constitutive of the subject. The subject is alienated in its very being initially. Lacan proposed that the mirror stage was part of an infant's development from 6 to 18 months, as outlined at the 14th International Psychoanalytical Congress at Marienbad in 1936. By the early 1950s, Lacan's concept of the mirror stage had evolved. He no longer considered the mirror stage as a moment in the life of the infant, but as representing a permanent structure of subjectivity, or as the paradigm of imaginary order. This evolution in Lacan's thinking becomes clear in his later essay titled, The Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire. The child's initiation into what Jacques Lacan would call the mirror stage entails a libidinal dynamism, caused by the young child's identification with its own image and creation of what Lacan terms the ideal I, or Ideal ego. This reflexivity inherent in fantasy is apparent in the mirror stage, since to recognize oneself as I is like recognizing oneself as other. Yes, that person over there is me. This act is thus fundamentally self-alienating. Indeed, for this reason feelings towards the image are mixed, caught between hatred, I hate that version of myself because it is so much better than me, and love, I want to be like that image. A type of repetition compulsion develops from this vacillation as the attempt to locate a fixed subject proves ever elusive. The mirror stage is a drama, which manufactures for the subject, caught up in the lure of spatial identification, the succession of fantasies that extends from a fragmented 5-body image to a form of its totality. This misrecognition, seeing an ideal I where there is a fragmented, chaotic body, subsequently, characterizes the ego in all its structures. The mirror stage is a phenomenon to which I assign a twofold value. In the first place, it has historical value as it marks a decisive turning point in the mental development of the child. In the second place, it typifies an essential libidinal relationship with the body image. Lacan, Some Reflections on the Ego, 1953. As Lacan further develops the mirror stage concept, the stress falls less on its historical value and ever more on its structural value. Historical value refers to the mental development of the child and structural value to the libidinal relationship with the body image. 7. In Lacan's fourth seminar, La Relation d'Objet, he states that the mirror stage is far from a mere phenomenon which occurs in the development of the child. It illustrates the conflictual nature of the dual relationship. The dual relationship, relation duel, refers not only to the relation between the ego and the body, which is always characterized by illusions of similarity and reciprocity, but also to the relation between the imaginary and the real. The visual identity given from the mirror supplies imaginary wholeness to the experience of a fragmentary real. See Lacan's paper, The Mirror Stage is Formative of the Function of the I as Revealed in Psychoanalytic Experience, the first of his Ecrits. The mirror stage describes the formation of the ego via the process of identification, the ego being the result of identifying with one's own specular image. At 6 months the baby still lacks coordination, see Louis Bolk. However, Lacan hypothesized that the baby can recognize itself in the mirror before attaining control over its bodily movements. The child sees its image as a whole, but this contrasts with the lack of coordination of the body and leads the child to perceive a fragmented body. This contrast, Lacan hypothesized, is first felt by the infant as a rivalry with its own image, because the wholeness of the image threatens it with fragmentation. Thus the mirror stage gives rise to an aggressive tension between the subject and the image. To resolve this aggressive tension, the subject identifies with the image. This primary identification with the counterpart is what forms the ego. Evans, 1996. The moment of identification is to Lacan a moment of jubilation since it leads to an imaginary sense of mastery. Ecrits, The Mirror Stage. Yet, the jubilation may also be accompanied by a depressive reaction, when the infant compares his own precarious sense of mastery with the omnipotence of the mother. La Relation d'Objet. This identification also involves the ideal ego which functions as a promise of future wholeness sustaining the ego in anticipation. The mirror stage, Lacan also hypothesized, shows that the ego is the product of misunderstanding. Lacan's term, mechanisance, implies a false recognition. Additionally, the mirror stage is where the subject becomes alienated from itself, and thus is introduced into the imaginary order. The mirror stage has also a significant symbolic dimension. The symbolic order is present in the figure of the adult who is carrying the infant. The moment after the subject has jubilantly assumed his image as his own, he turns his head toward this adult who represents the big other, as if to call on him to ratify this image. 10th Seminar, Langlois, 1962–1963. 6. The Function and Field of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis at the Rome Congress of Romance Language Psychoanalyst. On the 26th of September, 1953, Lacan delivered a paper entitled, Fonction et champ de la parole et du langage en psychanalyse, the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis. 1. This paper, often referred to as the Rome Discourse, marked Lacan's break with the analytic establishment and the formation of his own school of psychoanalytic thought. Also in 1953, Lacan and a group of colleagues left the Société Psychanalytique de Paris (SPP) to form the Société Française de Psychanalyse (SFP). The Rome Discourse came to the paper. The founding statement of Lacanian theory defines psychoanalysis as a practice of speech and a theory of the speaking subject. Psychoanalysis, he asserts, is distinguished from other disciplines in that the analyst works on the subject's speech. He points out that Freud often referred to language, particularly when he was focusing on the unconscious. After all, language is the talking cure, be seen as the founding document of the SFP, and of a new direction in psychoanalysis. 3 orders. The theory of the 3 interacting orders, the symbolic, the imaginary and the real, first appears in detail in this paper. These orders can be conceived as different planes of existence which, though interconnected, are independent realities, each order being concerned with different functions. Imaginary. The imaginary order includes the field of fantasies and images. It evolves out of the mirror stage but extends into the adult subject's relationships with others. The prototype of the typical imaginary relationship is the infant before the mirror, fascinated with its image. The imaginary order also seems to include preverbal structures, for example, the various, primitive, fantasies of children, psychotic and perverse patients. Symbolic. The symbolic order is concerned with the function of symbols and symbolic systems. Language belongs to the symbolic order. It is through the symbolic order that the subject is constituted. The real order is the most elusive of these categories, and is linked to the dimensions of sexuality and death. It seems to be the domain outside the subject. The real is the domain of the inexpressible, of what cannot be spoken about, for it does not belong to language. It is the order where the subject meets with inexpressible enjoyment and death. This paper sets out Lacan's major concerns for the following decade. 7. And language. The distinction between an understanding of the speech subject. The elaboration of the central concepts of the comma as distinct from the I and, above all, comma signifier and the symbolic order. Dot.